the shadow of Hecate, goddess of Crossroads and the dark moon archetype. There are certain figures from antiquity that civilization repeatedly attempts to sanitize because their original symbolic force remains psychologically dangerous. Hecate is one of those figures. Modern culture often reduces her either to a Halloween caricature of a wicked witch or to a softened love and light spiritual mascot stripped of all existential gravity. Both distortions obscure the same underlying reality. Hecate emerged from the ancient world not as a trivial supernatural ornament, but as a liminal sovereign whose symbolic domain encompassed death, transition, uncertainty, initiation, psychic fragmentation, and the terrifying freedom that accompanies transformation. To understand why Hecate still matters, one must first understand what a crossroads represented in the ancient imagination. Modern people usually interpret crossroads as simple intersections of travel. In antiquity, they represented something much more psychologically and spiritually charged. A crossroads was the place where certainty dissolved. It was the boundary between one established order and another unknown possibility. It was simultaneously geographical, psychological, spiritual, and political. Trade routes crossed there. Armies marched through them. Criminals were executed near them. Travelers disappeared at them. Decisions made there could alter dynasties, destinies, and identities. Hecate ruled these spaces because she ruled liminality itself. The ancient Greek term liminal derives conceptually from thresholds, doorways, and transitional states. Hecate's power existed precisely where categories failed to remain stable. She belonged neither fully to Olympus nor fully to the underworld. Hesiod's Theogony describes her as possessing authority in heaven, on earth, and in the sea, a remarkably expansive sovereignty for a goddess who later became associated primarily with ghosts and witchcraft. Hesiod, trans. 2006. This matters because it reveals that Hecate's original role was not marginal. She was not initially imagined as an isolated deity of superstition lurking on the fringes of Greek religion. She occupied a cosmological position that transcended ordinary divisions. Over time, however, civilizations tend to reinterpret liminal figures in light of their anxieties. As patriarchal religious systems centralized authority and increasingly sought to regulate acceptable forms of spirituality, independent feminine power connected to death, intuition, and transformation became culturally destabilizing. Hecate gradually transformed from a cosmic intermediary into a darker and more feared figure associated with necromancy, restless spirits, poison, and forbidden knowledge. Yet this transformation did not erase her importance. Instead, it revealed the growing discomfort civilization possessed toward the unconscious dimensions of human existence. The historical evolution of Hecate mirrors a recurring pattern within human societies. Powers that cannot be controlled institutionally are first marginalized, then demonized, and finally trivialized. This pattern appears repeatedly in the treatment of ecstatic religions, folk traditions, indigenous cosmologies, visionary practices, and archetypes associated with feminine autonomy. Hecate became dangerous not because she represented evil, but because she represented contact with forces that civilized order could never fully contain. This is why her twin torches matter. The torches carried by Hecate were not symbols of comfort. They were instruments of navigation within uncertainty. Ancient depictions often show her holding blazing lights while standing in darkness, guiding Persephone through transitions between worlds or accompanying souls across dangerous thresholds. Symbolically, the torches represent consciousness entering spaces where ordinary orientation fails. Psychologically, this symbolism remains profoundly relevant. Human beings encounter crossroads repeatedly throughout life: divorce, death, addiction, illness, ideological collapse, war, betrayal, aging, spiritual crisis, identity fragmentation, and existential disillusionment. Modern therapeutic language often frames such experiences in clinical or procedural terms, but ancient mythological systems recognize them as encounters with the unknown dimensions of existence itself. Hecate symbolizes the psychological mechanism by which consciousness survives entry into chaos without being permanently consumed. Carl Jung argued that mythological figures operate as archetypal structures emerging from the collective unconscious rather than as merely fictional characters invented arbitrarily by cultures. Jung, 1968. From this perspective, Hecate persists because she personifies a recurring psychic reality embedded within human cognition. The crossroads is not merely a literal location. It is the condition of confronting incompatible identities, conflicting impulses, or unresolved psychological contradictions. Her triple form intensifies this symbolism. Ancient depictions frequently portray Hecate as triple-bodied or triple-faced, standing in three directions simultaneously. Scholars debate the precise historical origins of this imagery, but symbolically, the implications are profound. The triple form reflects awareness extending beyond linear perception. She sees what lies ahead, behind, and hidden within the surrounding darkness. This triadic symbolism likely resonated because human consciousness itself experiences time in fractured ways. Individuals exist simultaneously within memory, present identity, and imagined future. Trauma further complicates this structure by causing parts of the psyche to become trapped within unresolved emotional states. Hecate's triple gaze, therefore, represents more than mystical ornamentation. It symbolizes the capacity to perceive multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously without collapsing into fragmentation. In many ancient traditions, three-way crossroads were considered spiritually volatile locations because they represented unresolved possibilities. Offerings known as diapna were left for Hecate at these intersections, particularly during the dark moon phase, when the visible lunar cycle disappeared into temporary absence. Johnston, 1990. These rituals acknowledge the belief that invisible forces became especially active during periods when ordinary structures dissolved. The dark moon itself is central to understanding Hecate's archetypal significance. Modern spirituality frequently romanticizes lunar symbolism while avoiding its more disturbing implications. The full moon receives celebration because it symbolizes visibility, illumination, fertility, manifestation, and emotional expansion. The dark moon represents the opposite condition: absence, dissolution, uncertainty, withdrawal, and confrontation with unconscious material. Ancient societies understood that destruction and transformation are inseparable processes. Seeds germinate underground before emerging into visible life. Psychological growth frequently requires identity collapse before reconstruction becomes possible. Yet modern consumer culture systematically resists this reality because economic systems depend heavily upon perpetual stimulation, distraction, productivity, and image maintenance. The dark moon archetype threatens these systems because it represents the necessity of descent. Hecate governs that descent. She appears where identities disintegrate, and previously stable narratives fail. This is why she became associated with ghosts. Ghosts symbolize unresolved memory. They represent emotional energies that refuse to integrate into the conscious order. Entire civilizations possess ghosts in this sense. Historical atrocities, suppressed cultural memories, collective shame, ideological contradictions, and intergenerational trauma all continue exerting influence precisely because they remain psychologically unresolved. Hecate's role as Queen of Ghosts, therefore, reflects more than superstition. She presides over the return of what societies attempt to repress. This symbolic relationship becomes especially important when examining witchcraft traditions historically associated with Hecate. Popular culture often portrays witchcraft through simplistic binaries of fantasy empowerment or religious panic. Historically, however, witchcraft accusations frequently emerged around individuals, particularly women, who occupied liminal social positions. Midwives, herbalists, widows, healers, outsiders, and women existing beyond conventional patriarchal structures often became associated with dangerous knowledge precisely because they operated near boundaries that civilization feared. Hecate's connection to witchcraft reflects this dynamic. She represented forms of knowledge not mediated through centralized institutional authority. Folk medicine, dream interpretation, necromantic ritual, herbal intoxication, ecstatic states, and intuitive spiritual practices all existed outside rigid systems of official control. This did not automatically make such practices benevolent or harmless. Ancient practitioners themselves understood that engagement with liminal forces carried psychological risks. Yet the fear surrounding Hecate reveals a broader cultural conflict regarding who possesses legitimate authority over meaning, transformation, and contact with the unknown. This conflict persists today. Modern society publicly celebrates technological mastery while privately experiencing escalating existential fragmentation. Rates of anxiety, depression, alienation, addiction, and ideological extremism suggest that many individuals experience profound disconnection from coherent symbolic structures capable of integrating suffering meaningfully. Consumer identity offers stimulation but often fails to provide existential orientation. Institutional distrust continues to increase across political, religious, and media systems. Under such conditions, archetypes associated with liminality and transformation inevitably regain psychological relevance. Hecate returns culturally because civilization itself increasingly resembles a crossroads. One can observe this symbolically in the growing fascination with occult aesthetics, shadow work, trauma integration, liminal spaces, and narratives centered upon psychological descent. Much of this interest is diluted by commercialization, yet beneath the aesthetic surface lies a deeper cultural impulse. Individuals sense intuitively that something within modern consciousness remains profoundly unintegrated. Jung referred to this process as confrontation with the shadow, the encounter between conscious identity and aspects of the psyche that the ego rejects, denies, or disowns. Jung, 1959. The shadow contains not only destructive impulses but also suppressed creativity, instinct, grief, rage, intuition, sexuality, vulnerability, and transformative potential. Civilizations possess shadows just as individuals do. Hecate functions as a guide into this territory. Importantly, she does not eliminate darkness. This distinction matters because contemporary self-help culture frequently promotes a fantasy of perpetual positivity that collapses under genuine existential pressure. Ancient mystery traditions understood that psychological transformation requires confronting realities the conscious mind instinctively avoids. Mortality, ambiguity, betrayal, powerlessness, and chaos cannot simply be transcended through affirmational thinking. Hecate's torches do not destroy the night. They provide enough illumination to continue moving through it. This symbolic nuance explains why Hecate appears repeatedly during moments of historical instability. In late antiquity, periods marked by political fragmentation and spiritual transition intensified interest in mystery religions, magic, and liminal deities. In modernity, renewed interest in Hecate frequently accompanies cultural disillusionment with mechanistic worldviews that are incapable of addressing existential depth. The Enlightenment produced extraordinary scientific advancement, yet it also accelerated the desacralization of symbolic consciousness. Rationalism generated immense explanatory power regarding material processes while often marginalizing mythological and archetypal modes of understanding as primitive remnants of pre-modern ignorance. However, the unconscious mind does not disappear merely because intellectual systems reject symbolic language. Instead, suppressed archetypal energies frequently re-emerge through distorted channels. Political fanaticism, mass ideological contagion, cultic movements, compulsive consumerism, celebrity worship, conspiratorial thinking, and digitally amplified tribalism all reveal quasi-religious psychological structures operating beneath ostensibly secular societies. Human beings continue to seek initiation, meaning, identity, sacrifice, transcendence, and symbolic orientation regardless of whether dominant institutions consciously acknowledge these impulses. Hecate remains significant because she represents an archetype capable of navigating psychic fragmentation without denying its existence. The crossroads demands a decision. This is another crucial aspect of her symbolism, often overlooked by modern interpretations that focus exclusively on aesthetic darkness. Crossroads are not passive locations. They require choice under conditions of uncertainty. One cannot remain indefinitely suspended within liminality without psychological consequences. Transitional states become pathological when individuals refuse movement entirely. Hecate, therefore, embodies not merely descent, but guided transition. In mythological terms, she assists Demeter in searching for Persephone after her abduction into the underworld. Symbolically, this narrative reflects consciousness attempting to recover aspects of itself that were lost during unconscious descent. Hecate becomes the intermediary because she alone navigates both realms competently. She understands the logic of darkness without becoming consumed by it. This intermediary role distinguishes her from purely destructive chthonic forces. Many modern depictions mistakenly portray Hecate as synonymous with chaos itself. Ancient traditions suggest something more complex. She governs the boundary between order and chaos, mediating transitions between states rather than annihilating structure altogether. This distinction carries profound psychological implications. Healthy transformation requires controlled disintegration rather than absolute collapse. Individuals undergoing major life transitions often experience identity destabilization. Old assumptions dissolve before new structures fully emerge. During such periods, people become psychologically vulnerable to manipulation, addiction, extremism, or despair because uncertainty itself generates immense cognitive and emotional pressure. Archetypally, Hecate represents the capacity to endure transitional ambiguity while maintaining movement toward reintegration. This may explain why she became simultaneously associated with both terror and protection. Ancient households sometimes placed Hecate statues near entrances and gates as apotropaic guardians against harmful forces. This protective role appears paradoxical beside her associations with ghosts and necromancy until one understands the underlying symbolic logic. Those who understand darkness possess the capacity to navigate it more effectively than those who merely deny its existence. Civilizations repeatedly fail when they attempt to symbolically eliminate shadow rather than consciously integrate it. History demonstrates this pattern extensively. Political systems promising utopian purification frequently generate repression because they project all perceived evil externally while refusing acknowledgement of destructive capacities within themselves. Ideological absolutism depends psychologically upon shadow projection, the belief that corruption exists entirely within outsiders, enemies, heretics, or opposing tribes. Hecate's symbolism resists such simplification because she directly inhabits ambiguity. She is neither wholly benevolent nor wholly malevolent. She represents the reality that transformation emerges through encounters with uncertainty rather than through fantasies of total purity. This complexity makes her difficult for rigid ideological systems to assimilate comfortably. Even her association with dogs reflects liminal symbolism. Dogs occupied ambiguous positions within ancient cultures because they existed simultaneously as companions, scavengers, hunters, protectors, and creatures associated with death. Their howling often symbolized awareness of invisible presences crossing boundaries between worlds. Hecate's sacred dogs, therefore, reinforce her role as guardian of thresholds where ordinary perception fails. The continued fascination surrounding Hecate in contemporary culture reveals something important about the modern psyche. Despite unprecedented technological sophistication, many individuals experience profound symbolic starvation. Hyper-rational systems excel at explaining mechanisms while often struggling to address existential meaning. Metrics quantify productivity but rarely resolve suffering. Algorithms optimize engagement while amplifying fragmentation. Individuals increasingly inhabit psychologically disorienting environments saturated with information yet lacking coherent initiation structures to guide transitions into maturity, mortality awareness, or existential resilience. Under such conditions, archetypes associated with descent and transformation naturally regain influence. However, reclaiming Hecate meaningfully requires resisting both sensationalism and trivialization. She cannot be reduced to aesthetic rebellion, internet occult branding, or simplistic empowerment rhetoric without losing the symbolic depth that has historically made her archetype endure. Hecate represents the confrontation with the reality that consciousness itself emerges in part through darkness. The unconscious mind is not merely a storage container for pathology. It is also the source of intuition, imagination, symbolic perception, creativity, instinct, and spiritual experience. Yet accessing these dimensions requires entering territories where rational control becomes incomplete. Ancient mystery traditions encoded this understanding mythologically because myth communicates psychological truths through symbolic narrative structures. The dark moon archetype, therefore, does not celebrate suffering for its own sake. It recognizes that human transformation frequently occurs within periods of invisibility, uncertainty, grief, and dissolution before renewed coherence becomes possible. Modern culture often pathologizes these states immediately because they disrupt systems optimized for external performance and perpetual visibility. Yet many transformative processes remain inherently subterranean. Mourning unfolds invisibly. Identity reconstruction unfolds invisibly. Spiritual crisis unfolds invisibly. Trauma integration unfolds invisibly. The dark moon symbolizes these hidden processes. Hecate carries the torch through them. This is why her archetype remains psychologically alive despite centuries of distortion. Human beings continue confronting thresholds where established identities fail and new orientations have not yet emerged. Entire civilizations experience such periods historically. The anxiety saturating modern culture reflects not merely political instability or economic uncertainty, but a broader liminal condition in which inherited symbolic frameworks no longer provide sufficient orientation while replacement systems remain fragmented and unstable. At the crossroads, certainty dies first. Hecate waits there not as a demon of destruction, but as a witness to transition itself. Her presence reminds us that darkness is not always synonymous with evil. Sometimes, Darkness represents the condition required for hidden structures to become visible. Seeds germinate underground. Eyes adjust slowly to the night. The unconscious reveals itself gradually through symbols, dreams, crises, contradictions, and encounters with mortality. Civilization repeatedly attempts to exile such realities because they resist commodification and institutional simplification. Yet what is repressed does not disappear. It returns through symptom, projection, obsession, and archetype. Hecate returns because the Crossroads returns. The ancient world understood something modern culture frequently forgets: transformation begins where certainty ends. The torchbearer standing between worlds does not promise comfort. She promises passage.